And you're very welcome along to a wildcard edition of The Snap, your American football show here on Off the Ball. As well as it being a bye week for the San Francisco 49ers, it's also a bye week for J.R. Gilroy, who's taking the week off to get ready for the divisional round next week. But I'm here, fear not, and Cian Fahey will be along shortly to look ahead to the wildcard weekend that's coming. Before that, we should get into the college side of things. It's a busy time of year on that side of the ball as well. To that end, Ben Isaacs joins us on the line. Ben, how are things? Welcome to the show.
I'm fantastic. How are you?
Not too bad. Happy New Year and all that. As I said, a really busy time and one national title game that's already set. This much anticipated meeting of the long unbeaten Clemson and Joe Burrow's LSU. But generally, in terms of the college game, how's it gone this year, Ben?
It's been a little bit of a surprise because we're used to Alabama still being around at this point. This is the first time in the history of the college football playoff that Alabama has not made it. But in some ways, it's been very familiar. We've got Clemson, who are there and thereabouts every single season now. And you've got LSU, who've basically knocked off Alabama to take the SEC championship and find their way into the national championship. But Joe Burrow has been the story.
Yeah, and the two teams, like in terms of LSU and Clemson, got to this stage in very different ways last weekend. Can you just talk us through how those two games panned out?
Yeah, the college football playoff has a seeding system 1 to 4, and LSU went into the final conference championship games as number 2, and they performed so well in their championship game that they leapfrogged Ohio State, got to number 1, which meant they played Oklahoma. And Oklahoma at number 4 were the only team in that 4 who'd actually lost the game at any point all season. And it was felt that LSU should win reasonably comfortably. And I've watched a lot of Oklahoma, watched a lot of LSU, and I thought, do you know what? Oklahoma, they're better than some people think, and I think they could keep this tight, at least for, a half. And I couldn't have been more wrong. LSU just blew out Oklahoma. It was never close. Joe Burrow had 7 touchdowns. They beat Oklahoma 63-28, and if I'm honest, it wasn't even as close as 63-28 suggests. It was an absolute mismatch. It was a complete beatdown, and LSU pretty much took their foot off the pedal with about 20 minutes to go. Whereas Clemson and Ohio State, maybe the best semi-final that we've had in the college football playoff, they were so evenly matched. 2 unbeaten teams. Neither team had lost for such a long time. Obviously, something had to give. And when I was watching it, because it came straight after the LSU-Oklahoma game, you could see the contrast of how tight it was going to be. But Ohio State were up 16-0 after 20-odd minutes. But they scored an early touchdown and then 3 field goals. And when they scored that third field goal to make it 16-0, I thought Ohio State have blown it. They're up 16-0 and they have blown it because Clemson have been terrible all game. They will not continue to be terrible. And when Clemson finally click, Ohio State are going to wish they'd scored more than 16 points. And in the end, Clemson won 29-23. It was an instant classic. It was the first time Clemson had been tested all season. It was the first time that quarterback Trevor Lawrence has ever trailed in the second half of any point in his college career. So not only has he won every game, he's not even used to being behind at any point. He hasn't lost a game since he was in high school. So they squeaked past Ohio State, who did look really good and deserved to be that number 3. But Clemson now are kind of battle-tested, which LSU have had to do all season. They've had a tougher schedule. Now finally Clemson can look and think, okay, we've had something tough, but it's not going to fully prepare them for LSU.
Yeah. And in the court of public opinion, so the Atlantic Coast Conference, a lot of criticism that, as you said, Clemson haven't really been tested. Did that win at the weekend sort of put those things, or that sort of point of view, to bed in the wider scheme of things?
To be honest, I'm not sure it has. I think people still look at the ACC as Clemson and a bunch of other teams, especially the teams that are underachieving, the University of Miami and Florida State and Virginia Tech, teams that have been national title contenders that have just fallen away into mediocrity. Might even be flattering them. A lot of the time they've been absolutely terrible. And it's not great for Clemson. They could do with having more good teams to play against, because otherwise you get to these games against Ohio State and all of a sudden you've got to find a gear that you haven't got near at any point. It's the exact opposite to the SEC, which everyone feels is totally loaded. At the bottom end of the SEC, the Southeastern Conference, you've got a lot of bad teams, but to win, you've still got to beat the likes of Georgia and Auburn and Alabama and Florida. It's been a great year for the SEC and a bad one for the ACC, except they might end up with a national champion.
Yeah, and you mentioned Joe Burrow a couple of times, Ben, but just a word on Trevor Lawrence, because I don't remember, just from an NFL point of view, this amount of hype around a quarterback since probably Andrew Luck. Can you just describe for viewers or listeners who aren't familiar with Lawrence what kind of player he is?
He can do pretty much everything. He can put great velocity behind the ball. He seems to see the plays unfolding before the defensive backs. He's got an excellent brain. He stays so composed. Now, admittedly, he's had great offensive line, great coaching, and running backs to help him out. But the calmness that he displays in the pockets and his precision and leadership, to me, he's the best quarterback in college football right now, despite all the Joe Burrow stuff. Obviously, we're not going to see Trevor Lawrence for 12 months in the NFL because he's not draft eligible. But he does absolutely everything. And what really impressed me against Ohio State, they could see that the way the safeties were playing a bit deeper, and they let Trevor Lawrence run, which he doesn't always have to do. And the guy has really got some wheels. He can move when he has to move. You know, we're not looking at a Lamar Jackson, but perhaps in terms of movement, kind of a Mitch Trubisky, who is surprisingly mobile. Sometimes he'll stand back there and might take a sack, but when he chooses to move, he moves quickly.
Yeah, and just a quick word on the quarterbacks that are coming out this year, Ben, before I let you go. So Joe Burrow is nailed on for number one pick by all accounts. What's your evaluation on him coming into the pro game?
I really like Joe Burrow. Like most people, at the start of the season, I didn't expect him to be picked in the first couple of days of the draft. I thought he was a potential NFL prospect. You know, he started at Ohio State. He grew up and played his college football in Ohio. Comes from a football family. His dad has coached at various big universities. He had a really tough time at Ohio State. You know, I said about how LSU had been battle-hardened and Clemson finally have. You want to talk about battle-hardened? Joe Burrow had to go through so much at Ohio State, constantly ridiculed, not by players, but by his head coach, Urban Meyer. Refused to even call him by his real name, called him John, said he was a Division III quarterback, said he threw like a girl. And he didn't get the chance to get much game time at Ohio State. So he had to transfer, went to LSU, and not many kids from the Midwest end up down in the Deep South. And last year he was kind of finding his feet at LSU, and this year everything came together. He's a cool leader. He's tremendously accurate, probably the most accurate passer in college football, completed 78% of his passes this season. He does not have a rocket for an arm. He's not a huge, deep threat. Although he would deserve to be the number one pick, I do worry a little bit that he's a game manager. Halfway through the season, I've got to be honest, the player he reminded me most of was Andy Dalton, which, if you're a Cincinnati Bengals fan, isn't going to excite you. The idea that you're going to get rid of Andy Dalton after however many years and bring in the next Andy Dalton. But Andy Dalton was a fantastic quarterback at TCU at college level, and he certainly had his moments at the Cincinnati Bengals. The thing is with Joe Burrow, he's not Tua Tagovailoa, and Tua Tagovailoa would have been number one pick had he not been injured. Now, we'll find out in the next couple of days, on January the 6th, whether Tua is going to go back to Alabama, which apparently is a very, very strong possibility, or he will come out. And if he does come out for the NFL draft, he's going to be a high draft pick. And if he stays injury-free, I would expect him to have a better career than Joe Burrow. But if you were going to pick one player right now, it would be Joe Burrow. You know what he can do. You know he's healthy, but I think he's closer to his ceiling. The likes of Justin Herbert at Oregon, he's a taller guy. He's kind of a prototypical kind of in the Peyton Manning mold. He hasn't got Peyton Manning's talent, but he's an intelligent player. He's got a fantastic physique. He's tall. He can make pretty much every throw, but he's only had an okay season, so he's not going to get the buzz. And it could well be that Tua, even despite missing half the season, having a serious injury, may end up being picked before Herbert as well.
Yeah, I think a lot of NFL teams will be watching keenly on Monday to see what Tua's decision is. Ben Isaacs, thanks a million for joining us.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Great stuff. And a reminder that American Football and Off the Ball is brought to you in association with the Aer Lingus College Football Classic, Navy versus Notre Dame at the Aviva Stadium on August 29th. Check out collegefootballireland.com for game tickets and more. Now, time for the Pick Six.
The Pick Six on Off the Ball.
It's the most talked about segment in US sports. It's the Pick Six, which can only mean two things: terrible wordplay and some hot takes from Cian Fahey, who joins me on the line now. Cian, how are things?
Most talked about isn't necessarily a good thing.
Most talked about.
In my experience, it's normally a bad thing.
Any publicity is good publicity, Cian. Happy New Year and all that. We're into the big stuff now, playoff time, but did you enjoy the final weekend of regular season stuff? Did you get to watch much of it?
Yeah, it's always a weird weekend because you have these games where teams have nothing to play for, and then you have these teams who are playing for their whole season on the line. And fortunately enough, this year we got that 49ers Seahawks game at the end, and it was kind of like that old Rams-Titans Super Bowl where it went down to the very last play and went down to the very last yard of the field. So there was a lot of excitement there, so we can't really complain, but it was a little bit anticlimactic having just one team getting into the thing, or one in each conference getting in. And the Titans kind of beating the Texans backups was a real kind of, what was the point of the whole thing? We knew they were going to beat them all along. So that took away from the drama a little bit, but now we can focus on the playoffs either way.
Yeah, but before we get into the playoffs, we should talk about everyone's favourite topic, Cian. It's the Browns, and they've cleaned house. So topic one on the Pick Six, Browning out. GM is gone, head coach is gone. If Cian Fahey was employed as the new GM of the Cleveland Browns, what would he be? What would his restructure look like?
I'd be looking forward to join that queue of people who are being paid by the Browns to do nothing. That's what they're up to 4 or 5 people, I think, now who've been employed and fired. Like, this is like the Browns playoffs because they're doing it every single year now at this stage. The rebuild, to me, like, I'm probably very unpopular in this sense, that, or at least I'm in the minority in this sense, where I think Baker Mayfield is one of the biggest issues in Cleveland. I think blaming Freddie Kitchens is an easy way out. I don't think Freddie Kitchens is a good coach. I compared that hire to hiring Bob McAdoo in New York, where he was an effective offensive coordinator, and they just upgraded him based on that without any head coaching experience, without any character to suggest he was a good head coach. I think the GM had to go as well. Like, the Browns are such a mess because they had Sashi Brown in place, who was executing the rebuild. They were doing the tanking, and they were doing the all-out process of getting so bad that they could become so good. And then they abandoned that to hire a GM who was going to rush to 8-8, and that's exactly what he did. So they fired him for that. So it's very hard to see what direction the Browns can go in from here without it being problematic, because they're going to stick with Mayfield, and I personally wouldn't stick with Mayfield. I would move on from Mayfield, look for a new quarterback. And you have a couple of options who will be coming in free agency. You have a couple of options in the draft. They're picking 10th, I believe, in the draft, so they might be able to grab someone there. It's hard to know at this stage of the year. But overall, that franchise kind of needs an overhaul from a level higher than this. They need a new owner. Jimmy Haslam has gone through, I think, 7 head coaches and GMs at this point, and he's only owned the team since 2013, I think, which is a crazy, crazy number.
Yeah. Well, it seems Paul De Podesta, who people might know if they've seen Moneyball, Jonah Hill's character is kind of based on him. So that's who's going to be the GM. But in terms of head coaching, who do you think is going to get that gig, or who even wants this gig?
Well, there's like Matt Boole, who is the Baylor head coach, I think. He has already turned down the opportunity to even interview for it. So they're not exactly in demand. I think Mike McCarthy sounds like the kind of guy who is going to get that job. And Mike McCarthy has, over this recent weeks, talked about how he's completely rebuilt his approach to being a head coach, how he's going to be this new diverse play caller, and he's embraced all these new concepts. And it's really hard to believe, because he was a head coach in Green Bay for most of the last decade, and he didn't do any of that at any point, when he could have done it whenever he wanted with the greatest quarterback that the league's ever seen. So why would we assume he's going to come in and be a completely different coach? I think he'll be the same type of coach, and it would follow like the Browns' suit, where they go from a coach who was completely unproven, a guy who didn't really have any experience, to a guy who's completely proven, but he's proven to be poor. So oftentimes you find these coaches or these teams will take the coach who failed and they will go the exact opposite direction. So you're looking at a guy like Mike McCarthy and a guy like Ron Rivera, but Ron Rivera has obviously gone to Washington now, so he's off the list.
Yeah, and Dallas, that vacancy has finally arisen. In terms of other coaching availability, is there any other vacancies that are catching your eye, or this whole coaching carousel, as the Americans like to call it?
Well, Dallas is the one, really, isn't it? The only thing there is you have to hope that Jerry Jones leaves you alone and that Stephen Jones goes to work and you're allowed to do what you want to do. Like, it's taken them a week to fire Jason Garrett because they were attached emotionally to Jason Garrett rather than attached to him as a quality coach. But you've got Dak Prescott there. You've got an effective offensive line, though it's an offensive line that's in decline. You've got skill position players there who are good enough, and you've got defensive pieces there that are good enough as well. You probably need to add to your secondary because the secondary was really disappointing this year. You need to hope that Leighton Van Der Esch gets healthy. You have a lot of money tied up in a lot of players, which is the one thing that's bad about that job. You don't really have any flexibility to kind of rebuild a team. So overall, yeah, that Cowboys job is really good, just with the caveat of you don't have much money to spend elsewhere, and you've got an owner who, let's face it, is a little bit of a meddler, really. He's someone who wants to play a certain way, who wants to do work a certain way, and if you don't want to fall in line, you're not going to get along there, which is what we saw prior to Jason Garrett. And Jason Garrett's greatest strength is falling in line.
Yeah. So on to number 2 on the chart now. It's bye. So we should mention the 4 teams who aren't in action because they've been so good all year that they don't have to play this weekend. And just a word on each of these, Cian. So the Packers, it feels like they've gone a little bit under the radar given the star power at quarterback, obviously, the new coach. But what have you made of the job that Matt LaFleur has done and the Packers generally?
I think they've gone under the radar, but I think they deservedly have gone under the radar. This is the worst 13-3 team I've ever seen. This isn't a team that belongs with a bye. This isn't a team that should be a high seed. This is a team that has scraped past teams constantly. They got blown up by the 49ers earlier in the year. They just played the Lions with a backup quarterback in Week 17, and they were down by 14 points and had to come back in the second half. Aaron Rodgers was really poor in that game. It's one of his worst games he's played in a long time. And if he plays like that, there is no other way the team can win because they are completely reliant on Aaron Rodgers, Devontae Adams, and Aaron Jones to carry the offense. Now, saying, this team needs its best players to play well is one thing, but saying a team that has no other effective talent outside of those 2 guys on one side of the ball is a major issue. And for as good as Zadarius Smith and Preston Smith have been as new additions to the team, and Adrian Amos has been fine, defensively, they still kind of are a little bit inconsistent. You think if they come up against a really good team, one of these, like if they come up against the Chiefs or someone like that in the Super Bowl, or if they come up against the Ravens, you feel like they're going to get blown out again. So if they're going to play the winner of the Saints Minnesota, I believe, if they're going to play whichever team comes out of there, you wouldn't really be confident in them. You think they will beat Minnesota because they've got Kirk Cousins, but you wouldn't expect Minnesota to beat the Saints in New Orleans. So I feel like this is going to be a built-in upset in Lambeau whenever they play their next game in 2 weeks or in 7 or 8 days, whatever it is. This team as a whole it's a little bit ahead of its schedule, I guess, because Matt LaFleur did come in with a team that needed to be rebuilt, and the new GM has done a really good job, but they just aren't really on that level that the record suggests they are. Aaron Rodgers is an older quarterback too, so their timelines are a little bit contrasting, where the rest of the team needs to be rebuilt and Rodgers' career is coming to a close.
Yeah. And conversely, if the Packers haven't really hit all the heights, like the 49ers have seemed inevitable all year, there's something about them, like the intangibles of the way they're able to get stuff done in the clutch moments, and then also the tangibles of they're so quick on both sides of the ball, and they leaned on defence early in the year, and now their offence is kind of bailing them out a bit. So what do you think of the 49ers? I think like they're nailed on for the Super Bowl.
I think they've impressed. I think they've gotten better, and I think one of the big keys for me is Jimmy Garoppolo has gotten a little bit tighter with his play. Like you're not necessarily seeing huge numbers or whatever, but in the Saints game, in the Seahawks game, he's stopped making the big errors that he was making previously that made me very skeptical of him. He's showing a lot more now in terms of his consistency, in terms of his all-around play and his fit in that offense, and I think it's running a lot smoother, his performance individually, even though I think the rest of the team has probably taken a little bit of a step back. Joe Staley coming back at left tackle hasn't really been that smooth. You expect him to get better the more he plays. I think that's a team where you could see them winning with ease, whoever they play in 2 weeks or in 10 days, whatever it is, or you could see them actually being upset just because they haven't been there and they haven't had this experience, which is something that happens quite a lot. Like one of the interesting elements, and we're obviously going to talk about this with the Ravens, but one of the interesting elements to me is in the NFL, oftentimes a team has to lose in the playoffs before it can actually reach the Super Bowl. You saw it with the 49ers, you saw it with the Seahawks when they lost to the Falcons. You've seen it over this decade. Outside of the Patriots, most teams kind of have to go through a little bit of a rough postseason and then get there afterwards. And I do think there's a real element to that because you overcome the stage of it, you overcome the learning process of playing in the postseason, and it becomes more of a natural feel to you. And it's why I would be more likely to pick like veteran teams. Like As an example, this weekend, the Seahawks and the Eagles are playing each other. The Russell Wilson and that Seahawks coaching staff has, well, not the coaching staff, but Russell Wilson over Carson Wentz has a lot more experience, so I would be more inclined to lean towards them. And that's the one thing this 49ers team is lacking.
Yeah, and just quickly on the AFC side of things, so the Ravens and the Chiefs, so comparatively the Ravens have had a pretty plain sailing. They were 2-2 and they've won every game since then, whereas the Chiefs have had that sticky patch in mid-season, lost the quarterback. Mahomes didn't look great. Now he looks a lot healthier, and they seem to be hitting form at the right time, which is, if I was a Chiefs fan, that seems to have all the hallmarks of a championship winning team, where they kind of hit their stride at the right time.
Yeah, I wrote this Off the Ball last week that I think these are the two best teams in the league now, not just in the AFC. I think the Chiefs' defense has played better over in recent weeks. I think Patrick Mahomes is a great equaliser regardless. It's a funny situation for the Ravens to be in because they have blown everyone away all year and they've dominated, and their reward might be playing the Chiefs in the AFC Championship game. One team that has beaten them, well, one of two teams that has beaten them, but the one team remaining that has beaten them. And for as much as you can talk about Marcus Peters and the upgrade in the secondary and how much better they've played, going against Patrick Mahomes is going against Patrick Mahomes. That's never an easy task, and he's proven that over the second half of the season. He's gotten healthy again. You've got Tyreek Hill there, you've got Travis Kelce there, Sammy Watkins is still Sammy Watkins, and Damian Williams has played better over the second half of the year than he played compared to the first half of the year. I do think that team is going in the right direction. I do think it's an extremely dangerous team. Obviously, you have to look at last year when the Patriots went in and just ran the ball over and over and over again, and you would assume someone was going to play that works for them, but it's really hard to write them off because of what they've got offensively, even though they're defensive frailties. Tyrann Mathieu as well, we have to point out, he was an off-season signing who has really, really worked out. He's gotten better the more he's been there. He's kind of been reflective of the defense as a whole. The better he's played, the better everyone around him has played, which makes sense because he's someone who puts people in the right positions. He's someone who's diagnosing plays and organising everyone around him. So the signs are for Andy Reid are really positive, and it might be a good thing for Andy Reid because we've seen Andy Reid go into the playoffs as this celebrated top seed and everyone talking about him, and that's not really happening, and he's disappointed in the past. Maybe this year, with all the focus being on the Ravens, it might be easier for them.
Yeah, and the Ravens breaking all sorts of records. The 41-year record that stood for rushing totals, they've broken that. And also, first team ever in the NFL since 1950s anyway to get 200 yards rushing and passing. So they're a fearsome threat going into the playoffs. Moving on to number 3, Say What. So JJ Watt is back, Cian. I thought this guy was out for the rest of the season and he's miraculously back for the playoffs. Do you think he's going to have any impact, or is this more of like a figurehead coming back to like Ray Lewis style to just kind of boost morale almost?
Well, Ray Lewis style, if it was in that play, if he plays the way Ray Lewis played, it won't be a positive because Ray Lewis was not good when he came back and whatever else was going on there. Yeah. I think the idea of Watt coming back is obviously impressive. The idea of the rehab process that got him there is something he'd have to go through. That's mad. And he's also said, hey, this might be a case of me going out playing and it going straight away and me having to go straight back off the field. That's the worst case scenario. Well, that's what he claims the worst case scenario is. The worst case scenario to me is they play Watt even though he's at 50% of what he is or 60% of what he is, and that actually makes him worse than someone you could have replaced him with, which is a very dangerous thing because you get these emotional attachments to players like JJ Watt who are very good for a very long time, and it's difficult for the coaching staff to say, no, you need to sit down if he's available, if he's physically there, even if he's active, even if he's not doing what you need him to do on the field. And I think the big thing in this is the matchup. I don't necessarily think they need JJ Watt to win this game. I also don't necessarily think JJ Watt is hugely valuable in this game. You have to look at what Watt does very well. He does everything pretty well, but what his primary values are as a penetrating pass rusher who can line up in different spots on the defensive line. Obviously, he's a big body, but he's also an explosive body and someone who can bend the edge and do all sorts of different things with his hands that have made him such a great pass rusher. But in this game, you're really going to need to stop the run. Josh Allen is very, very unlikely to beat you. Josh Allen had probably one good game all year, and that was in that Dallas game in primetime. Outside of that, he spent his time being the worst deep passer in the league, missing wide open throws, completely misreading defenses, giving up opportunities to turn the ball over, even though they haven't always been capitalized on. So you don't necessarily need a primetime pass rusher. You don't need JJ Watt to come in and get 3 or 4 sacks and constantly be pressuring the quarterback. You need a defensive line and linebackers who are going to be disciplined and who are going to stay in their gaps and stop Devin Singletary, stop Frank Gore, and contain Josh Allen when he drops back and could potentially scramble. So I think if you were more confident a little bit this weekend, and maybe it's hard to do in the playoffs, you would hold Watt off. You would keep him until next week because chances are they will be playing next week. You're at home. You've got a home field advantage. You've got the better quarterback. You've got the better team in general. Buffalo haven't really beaten anyone all year, even though they've made this point. I would be very confident as a Texans fan. The only real concern there is Will Fuller might not play, and that completely changes their offense.
Yeah, Will Fuller has somehow become like the J.J. Watt of their offense. But Deshaun Watson, who kind of underperformed himself this time last year, it's kind of a big moment for him because he's not a young kid anymore necessarily, considering the new crop has come through and impressed already. So he needs to stand up and perform this weekend.
Yeah, and he didn't play well in his last playoff game against the Colts, where there was a lot of straight dropbacks and a lot of throwing the ball, trying to diagnose coverages and making mistakes, and that's why Will Fuller matters so much. When Will Fuller is on the field, the offense gets to dictate a little bit more what type of plays they're going to run, because you can't stop Will Fuller stretching the field. You have to commit an extra defender to him, or you have to have a cornerback playing really far off. And if the cornerback plays really far off, you can have these easy, quick throws underneath, because always DeAndre Hopkins is going to attract attention. So if you then have to give more attention to Will Fuller or play him more aggressively, those big shot plays that Watson likes to hit all the time come open. If Will Fuller isn't in the lineup, it's a lot easier to cover whoever else comes in and replaces him, because you can just focus on Hopkins then, and the play action elements become less effective, so you can't actually have Watson hit these hard bootlegs, run into the flat and throw the ball deep all the time. You've got to have him drop back and move the ball by 5 to 10 yards all the time, move it downfield on intermediate throws, and that's a lot more of a challenge for him because he hasn't proven that he can do that consistently.
Yeah, so that's number 3. Say what? We're going with the Texans to win this game, are we?
In this matchup, but that's not necessarily saying a huge amount.
So we're going with the Texans to win, do you think?
I think they should win comfortably, but the Bills, that defense is pretty good, so they can always grab a couple of turnovers.
Grand. And on to number 4, the Patriot Wane. This is it, isn't it, Cian? Like, this time last year, I wrote them off against the Chargers, and they came out and won, and then they won the Super Bowl, so I'm not going to prematurely diagnose them as done, but this is it, isn't it? The dynasty's over.
Wait, are you picking the Titans?
I'm leaning that way, but I need some corroboration on my
I need you to do it with me, so I'm not the worst person on my own out here.
Let's go for it.
I think we have to. Like, the bigger question, and I put this up last night, is do the Titans have a better quarterback right now?
Absolutely.
Like, they have the more athletic quarterback. They have the more comfortable quarterback, at least. Tom Brady. So I went through last week's game because I had to figure out how the Patriots lost to the Dolphins. For as much as the Patriots have fallen off, you would not expect them to lose to the Dolphins. And former Patriots defensive coordinator Brian Flores did something that's pretty obvious, and I think many teams can replicate this and should replicate this. They double-teamed Julian Edelman. They kept extra defenders over the middle of the field at all times, and they often rushed only 3. They didn't go to heavy blitzes very often. So what that does, it forces Tom Brady to throw the ball outside the numbers to one-on-one matchups. You could have done that in the past when you had Randy Moss 10 years ago. You could always do it when you had Rob Gronkowski because it's an easy touchdown for him. If you go back to the Seahawks Super Bowl where Rob Gronkowski were lined up wide to the right against KJ Wright when the defense is focused on the middle of the field, Gronk runs right past KJ Wright, easy touchdown throw for Brady. You go back to the Rams game last year, not a touchdown throw, but the play down the seam that decided the game late in the fourth quarter to Gronk again was in a situation where Gronk lined up wide, got the one-on-one matchup, easy throw for Brady. He doesn't have that anymore. Matt Lacoste and whoever else is playing tight end is not going to do that for you anymore. Benjamin Watson is better for picking guys off. Mohamed Sanu is not going to do that for you anymore. So now, when you focus all your resources on the middle of the field and you don't blitz Brady to give him easy matchups and space outside, it's very difficult for him to make those throws. And you saw him repeatedly miss throws outside the numbers last week against the Dolphins. The Titans, defensively, they are better than the Dolphins. But are they as well coached? I'm not sure. Are they going to match up as well? I'm not sure. Jarrell Casey is a really valuable player, so you can line him up in the middle. Cameron Wake is there to come off the edge. Harold Landry has had a good year. They have the talent there, but the talent isn't necessarily on the outsides. Malcolm Butler is on IR, and he's not particularly good when he plays anyway. Adoree Jackson is another cornerback who's been unimpressive over the course of his career. So matchup-wise, the Patriots might be able to take advantage of them outside, and Kevin Byard will be in the middle, who Brady will have to be concerned with, because if he tries to force the ball to Edelman, that's where the turnovers will come. But overall, I'm kind of with you. The other side of this is the Patriots defensively are great in the secondary, and obviously had a rough go of it last week with Devontae Parker, and probably just a down week. But where they're not great is in the front seven. So in the front seven, the Titans will feel like they can use Derrick Henry and prolong drives and soak up and make the game fewer possessions for their offense, and they'll be able to move the ball like that. So matchup-wise, football-wise, it looks like the Titans are the better team. The only thing that terrifies me is picking against Bill Belichick at any time in the playoffs.
Yeah, absolutely. I think someone asked Mike Vrabel, what's the Patriot Way? And he says, I think that's where the movie theatre is in New England. So he's big to get one over on his old team anyway. So those two games are tomorrow. I think the TV executives are a little bit concerned about the Patriots as well, the fact that they've moved this game from Sunday to Saturday night, because they're not too sure the Patriots are going to be around next weekend for their late night game. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. Moving on to Sunday, number 5, Saints and Sinner. So weirdly, the Saints give a run out to Antonio Brown, which he has deemed a publicity stunt. The guy who's notorious for his own publicity stunt is calling this a publicity stunt. What did you make of that whole thing? Is that just, what was that even?
Antonio Brown really can't get out of his own way, Kenny, and I'm not sure, publicity stunt? What publicity did they get from that was good?
Yeah.
That was not, that's a situation where people are talking about you don't want them to be talking about you. It's, the Saints did this with Des Bryant a couple of years ago. They checked him out, they brought him in, eventually he got hurt again, but I think this was more about next season and more about if he gets all these investigations cleared on him, and because even if they signed him this year, he would have been put in the commissioner's exempt list, which means he wouldn't have played in the playoffs anyway. So the Saints are looking at Brown maybe next year. They're probably not anymore after his comments this week. So Brown keeps shooting himself in the foot. He keeps costing himself opportunities when it's very easy for him to be on a team because of how good he is. And the Saints are obviously interested in his level of talent. I honestly, there isn't such thing as a bad fit football-wise for Antonio Brown. He can do anything. He's great at everything. But the Saints might be kind of the worst fit for him. The Saints might be kind of the worst fit for him because you've got Michael Thomas there, who you're going to make the priority and make the focal point of all your play designs, and everyone else is a specific role filler. Like Ted Ginn is the guy who stretches the field. You've got Traquan Smith who works with the possession. Then you've got Taysom Hill, my favorite quarterback, playing wide receiver all the time, and he's doing very specific things as well. So if you bring Antonio Brown in next year even, it's completely changing the way your offense is. And it's very possible that the Saints are looking at Teddy Bridgewater next year. I know Drew Brees has been phenomenal, but he might retire. You don't really know at this stage of his career. And if you've got Teddy Bridgewater, as much as a good leader as he is considered to be, he's still a relatively young, relatively inexperienced quarterback. Do you really want Antonio Brown in that locker room with him as well, with Drew Brees gone at that point, in that hypothetical? That doesn't seem like the most logical way of building a team.
Yeah, and just in terms of this weekend, so the Saints probably a little bit unlucky, as we mentioned earlier, that they're not the number 2 seed here because they're probably a better team than the Packers, but they find themselves remarried with the Vikings from 2 years ago, the Minneapolis Miracle and all that, and then not to mention last season they had that egregious pass interference call that knocked them out. So it feels like this is their time to finally, if they're going to go to a Super Bowl, this will be the year.
Look, the argument in both of those games was the Saints let the game be close at the end when it shouldn't have been. And I don't think this game will be close. I think having it in New Orleans, we've seen how good Drew Brees has played over recent weeks, and I think it's the Vikings secondary has been pretty weak this year. The outside cornerbacks have really struggled, Xavier Rhodes in particular. So I think this is a perfect matchup for the Saints. It's a game where, Dalvin Cook is coming off an injury. He's not 100%. If he was 100%, it might be a little bit closer. But even then, I don't think the Vikings have enough. Adam Thielen has been at about 60% health for the last half of the season. He is nowhere near the player they need him to be. And that just kind of leaves you with Stephon Diggs and the play designs of Gary Kubiak, which are pretty good, but they're not good enough to keep pace with Drew Brees in that dome, playing the way he's played. I expect this to be a really comfortable victory. The Texans game, this game, are both really kind of lopsided matchups to me. The Patriots and Titans game are really close. The Eagles and Seahawks game is really close as well. But these are the two games I would be very confident in, and I think the Saints are going to win with relative ease.
Yeah, and we get on to number 6. It's the final game of the weekend, the late game on Sunday. Once upon a time in Hollywood, Cian. I feel like one way or another we're going to have some sort of romantic ending here. Either Marshawn Lynch is going to score a touchdown to win this game, or Carson Wentz is going to lead his valley of weird, random people off the street to another playoff win. So, after all he went through with the Foles thing, he had an MVP caliber year, and then Nick Foles went and won a Super Bowl for him, basically. Now he's back in prime, but he has no one to throw to, really. So it's kind of an interesting one for him. He's carried this team into the playoffs more or less by the skin of their teeth. Do you think they can go there and win? Or do you think they can win in Philly, rather?
Well, it's kind of funny, isn't it? Because this is Carson Wentz's first playoff game. You wouldn't think it because he's been in the league for quite a long time, but the way his career has spanned out, as a rookie, he didn't make the playoffs, and then he was injured for that Super Bowl run, and then he was injured again last year when Nick Foles came in again. It's a weird thing. Because normally when you have two teams play each other earlier in the year, it's got something you can go back and look at and project it forward, especially when it's played in the same place, because the Seahawks played the Eagles already this year. But that game is irrelevant because the Seahawks are missing all the running backs. Dwayne Brown was out last week. Whether he plays this week, I think he's anticipated he's going to play, but he's probably not at 100%. And then Carson Wentz and the Eagles are completely blown up. They're missing everyone. And you talk about skill position players, but to me, the one that really, really matters is the one that just happened last week with Brandon Brooks. Brandon Brooks at guard is one of the best players in the league and one of the most valuable players in the league, particularly for a quarterback like Carson Wentz, who isn't necessarily great at moving within the pocket. He's good at making the big athletic movements. He's good at breaking the pocket and sprinting and running away from defenders. He's not good when you have to ask him to make very small adjustments against pressure up the middle. And that's what Brandon Brooks stops. Without Brandon Brooks there, you have a lot more questions on the offensive line. There's going to be a lot more pressure coming up the middle. You have a Seahawks defense that has Jadeveon Clowney, who likes to work inside rather than outside, which is a big problem for Wentz. It's a big problem for Doug Peterson's play designs because he wants to build everything off of the run rather than have his quarterback drop back straight and throw the ball 40 times. This is a massive test for Wentz, and I think, to be fair, you would expect the Seahawks to win, but it's on the road. It's a team without their identity a little bit messed up because they've lost Chris Carson, they've lost CJ Prosise, they've lost Rashad Penny. They're down their top three running backs. And for most teams, you can lose your running backs, so it's not a big deal. For this Seahawks team, it's a huge deal because, one, those running backs were very, very good. But two, those running backs are really important for what they do. They want to run the ball. They need to run the ball. This is a game where, honestly, you can kind of pit Russell Wilson against Carson Wentz. Teams, because both teams are banged up, you can kind of just say, hey, it's quarterback versus quarterback a little bit. Maybe there'll be mistakes on receivers, there'll be mistakes on the offensive line around them, but it does feel like whichever quarterback plays better will win this game because of the way the teams are both set up.
Nice one, Cian. Thanks for joining us as ever, and enjoy the weekend of football.
Happy New Year. Have a good one.
All the best. That's more or less it for the Snap. Thanks to Cian and Ben for joining me, and to John O'Donnell and Enda Call for pulling the show together. A reminder that American Football and Off the Ball is brought to you in association with the Aer Lingus College Football Classic, Navy versus Notre Dame at the Aviva Stadium on August 29th. Check out collegefootballireland.com for game tickets and more. Cheers to all of you for tuning in as well. Until next week, it's goodbye from us.